Okay, so I think we are ready to start. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to this press conference. We have with us Ms. Radhika Coomaraswamy, a member of the UN fact-finding mission on Myanmar. She is presenting the latest report of the fact-finding mission, which is launched today. And you will now find it online. Direct link is in the press release, which you can find in the back. And there is also some brief summary of the report in the release. So without further ado, let's ask Ms. Coomaraswamy to give some opening remarks, and then we'll take questions.
Thank you very much. As you know, the fact-finding mission on Myanmar was set up in August 2017, just 2 weeks before the incidents that led to the humanitarian disaster took place. We have so far, our major report was last year. It's a 400-page report. It was based on, we did not gain access to Myanmar, but based on interviews with over 800 victims and witnesses, videos, satellite imagery, experts, and quite a large team of investigators. That report came out last year, and then our mandate was extended. So this year, we have a report that tries to put in place documents. Our mandate this year is to put in place material for the investigative mechanism that is being set up based on our last year's report. And we have also written 2 reports to look at some issues in depth. One of them is on economic interests of the Tatmadaw, which was released by my colleagues in Indonesia a month ago. And the second report, because of its prevalence, is on sexual violence in Myanmar, which is being released today. So that's the report you will get. So it is basically sexual violence during the armed conflict. Our basic argument has been, and it has formed over the last 2 years, is that the human rights violations we have asked to look into, the basic responsibility lies with the Tatmadaw. Whether it is not civilian government or other civilians, we found that actually it is basic to the Tatmadaw military strategy, which is called the four-cut strategy, which allows one to use force against the civilian population to intimidate and punish the civilian population as a tactic of war. So this is our finding. Now, one of the tools of that intimidation is sexual violence. It happens even in Kachin, or it happens in Shan, but it's egregious in Rakhine, and that's why in the report we say that it might even be an inference of genocide can be taken because of the nature and brutality that took place in the Rakhine. So this report then looks at some of the other issues of sexual violence, other than what was covered in last year's report in depth. First, it looks at issues relating to sexual slavery. It looks at issues relating to the silent issues, such as men and boys, and against the transgender community. It looks at sexual violence and discrimination by the ethnic armed organizations, which is something people don't generally explore. It looks about sexual violence in the context of forced labor. And it also looks at the root causes of sexual violence and the link between that and general discrimination and lack of respect for women in society. If I could quickly just go over these issues, the issue of sexual slavery and sexual violence, for example, as you know, we see this pattern, especially highlighted in our last report, the worst case study being the Tulatoli case, where after attack by ASA, there is what is called these famous clearance operations, where the Tatmadaw come in shooting, people are shot while fleeing. But what is important for us in this report is that the men are separated from the women. The women are then were taken to a house. In this house, they were gang raped in a situation of sexual slavery for days. And later they burnt the house down. We were able to, some of the women in the act of burning managed to escape and cross a boundary to Cox's Bazar, and we were able to interview. Our teams were in Cox's Bazar and had put together, if you look at the report from last year, you will see how they put together that whole episode, not only for the women, but all the men and boys. So sexual slavery is an important part of this, is something we wanted to highlight. Then the violence against men and boys. This is, in a way, a new area, generally in international law, but primarily in police stations and prisons. I myself interviewed one young man who was in Batadong prison. He said the political and Rohingya prisoners were kept separately. They were a special treatment, and they were subject to sexual violence. His story was corroborated by other young men kept in Batadong prison. They were also subject to forced nudity, as well as, perhaps for men and boys, the special particular problem of having to witness violence against women in their family. This was also something that was done. It's ultimate, of course, in Asia. It's the ultimate humiliation for women from very conservative societies. We also looked at the issue of violence against transgender people. As you know, in South Asia, despite its conservatism, including in the Rohingya community, the transgender community were a little nomadic, and they were very strong in the entertainment industry. There was a certain kind of autonomy to them. When the violence took place, they were brutally affected and were often the targets of this violence. And life in camps has become very difficult for them. It's very violent for them. And they have taken the nomadic status that the Hijras, as they were at South Asia, is also taken away. We also looked at the issue of forced labor and sometimes sexual violence in the context of forced labor by the Tatmadaw. As you know, the Tatmadaw's other practice is to use the local population to be porters, cooks, seamstresses, and in those practices also we managed to record cases of sexual violence in that context. And especially, interestingly, the ethnic Rakhine, who live in the Rakhine province and also have one serious issue of forced labor, and is one of the issues that the Arakan army that is now active in Arakan Reply has put forward as one of its claims. We have looked at violence and sexual violence by ethnic armed organizations as well. For them, it was not a tactic of war, but as you know, they recruit people from the community, sometimes forced. It is not sometimes voluntary. Women are used as cooks, nurses, cleaners, seamstresses, and sexual violence does take place in those situations, and we have case studies from that context. And we also worried in some of the ethnic armed areas some other practices like mass arranged marriages, the fact that sometimes victims have to marry their rapists, and also the notion of blood money in situations of rape, where that would be the way to resolve it. So I think for this report, more than the earlier one, for which not much information was got, has put also the focus on the non-state actors, the ethnic armed organizations. We looked at the root causes that Myanmar society, as you know, concludes that the discriminatory framework of laws and practices, even in peacetime, contribute and aggravate violence against women in wartime. But for the Rohingyas, there's also a much more severe inequality, which we have called a system like apartheid. For example, a non-Rohingya woman would have to need the consent of the state to marry a Rohingya man. The number and spacing of the children are regulated. A wife converting to the husband's religion, if she's a Buddhist, has to get the approval of the state. Then we have education opportunities are very. This is in Rakhine State. Education there is some primary education, but barely any secondary education, and no tertiary education for the Rohingyas. They have no freedom really of movement. They have to have various sets of passes to just even get out of their village. There's malnutrition. The highest in the world is in Rakhine, the northern Rakhine, where they come from. And healthcare as well. Because of the system of passes, they can't really get to the hospitals. So this freedom of movement based on the lack of an ID card or the right correct document affects them completely. We also want to just say that militarization across Myanmar, in every facet of life, researchers have found a link between that and higher levels of sexual violence. Finally, with regard to the findings, we looked at the refugee camps. On the one hand, they have become places for intimate partner violence, psychological and emotional abuse, sexual harassment, and some women have told the special representative on sexual violence that their children have gone missing, daughters have gone missing, and they think it's because they have been trafficked. Then the positive things with regard to refugee camps, of course, is the enhanced roles that women do seem to have, and more freedom of movement. They're learning certain skills. So they seem to, over the years, we've noticed, become more self-aware and seem to be organizing themselves, which is one of the positive things. Finally, the recommendations. As you know, our general overarching recommendation is the need for security sector reform under civilian oversight of the Tatmadaw. And we have pointed out that one of the reasons that is not there is their independent economic base. And that is one thing we have mentioned very clearly in our report, the fact that there are conglomerates, companies run by the military, and a network of businesses, primarily local but also international, who enter into joint ventures and others with the Tatmadaw. We're not saying not to do business in Myanmar, we're just saying only with the Tatmadaw. So I think that should be clear. Finally, we feel the whole legal framework needs to be brought up to give women the rights of sexual violence under the law. And we don't really feel that domestic remedies are possible in Myanmar. The case in study, of course, is the Indian case, where 10 men were killed, and there was 10 Rohingya men were killed by the military in 2007 in Indian. There was enormous pressure, even the Reuters journalists, as you know, to bring case against these for which they went to jail, and the case was brought. Military investigation was concluded, and 7 military officers were found guilty. But in 9 months, they were released. So we feel that because of the pressure from their families and from Buddhist monks and the others. So our sense is at the moment there is a need for an international mechanism. And finally, we feel and have put forward with the SRSG for violence against for Myanmar, not the special rapporteur, the need for a trust fund for victims. 1 million of them in Myanmar. And the issue of repatriation seems not to be going anywhere, even though there has been some 3,000 names that have been cleared. But early discussions seem not to have, people are still worried about a safe and dignified return. So let me just leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Coomaraswamy. So we'll take questions. Margaret.
Nice to see you again, Mrs. Coomaraswamy. Welcome back. I'll just follow up on that last point then on the returns, since you mentioned it. They're supposed to start this week, those 3,000. Do you feel that the conditions are there for safe, voluntary, and dignified returns after this report? And can you talk to us a little more about your finding? your premise that the government hasn't investigated or held responsible the perpetrators. So how would you propose, I don't know, what are you proposing to them, I suppose, to do it, other than having some sort of international mechanism? Are you still hoping to have some sort of Myanmar action? Or have you given up on it, basically, I guess is what I'm asking you. Thanks.
Well, with regard to the return, we have argued earlier that we feel that the conditions are not conducive. We have been shown satellite imagery which shows the situation in northern Rakhine, which is basically where all the villages have been bulldozed, not really at the time we looked at it, not a tree standing. There were some houses, but they were, I don't think, would pass muster with people to be abode. And it's not their original village. So people would not be going back to their original village. So I think there's a serious issue that there's a serious issue then of where are you going, where are they going to return. So the second one question is that it has to be voluntary, and if the IDPs living in Myanmar and Sittwe have not been relocated and have to live under this framework of what we call near-apartheid laws, what are we sending them into? Unless some kind of promise has been made, a pathway to citizenship that will give them rights, we feel that is also a problem. So to us, it's not only the issue of safety physically, but also the fact that they should not have to live like people are living in the displaced camps in Sittwe. And I think UNHCR is very aware of this, and they're consulting the communities, and with the 3,000 that have been cleared, and I don't think they will take them across unless they are confident that that is the case.
And on Myanmar, what do you hope?
Well, we feel at this particular point of time, there is no possible domestic. The Indian case was our only hope, and that after that we with maximum international publicity, Reuters journalist release, we thought this had created some kind of opening, but it didn't, and we find there's so much denial about what is taking place. I don't think it would be possible. I don't think we have the framework of laws for many of these, especially sexual violence in Myanmar, that would help. And we don't, I think, have the kind of independence mechanisms that we require. So the option is either a hybrid court or an international court. And, of course, hybrid court will depend on if you can find really individuals who are from Myanmar who are able to withstand any kind of political pressure or whatever. That, of course, has to be left to the international community. But we think an international mechanism is perhaps the best way to deal with this, and we have said that in the earlier report as well as this. The ICC is only covering a small area of the things, which is on the forced displaced. The International Criminal Court of Justice has not yet been, but though some of the, especially the OIC countries, feel that may be a route to go, or to maybe even set up a special court or tribunal that's hybrid.
Thank you. Betülürük with the Turkish News Agency. It's been almost 2 years and no one has been accountable for the crimes committed against the Rohingyas. I was wondering, you're talking about here for an international mechanism, and also you mentioned the political pressure. Do you think sanctions could be used as a tool for political pressure on the government of Myanmar? Thank you.
We have actually targeted. We don't want any sanctions against Myanmar or sanctions against the people of Myanmar. So if any sanctions are used, they must be targeted against specific individuals and assets, etc. We have especially recommended targets against the Tatmadaw economic interests and the Tatmadaw personnel whom we felt were involved in some of these atrocities. That's mainly our sanctions have been, our recommendations for sanctions have been on that score. So we have requested in our economic interest report for companies and individuals not to have business dealings with the conglomerates and private companies of the Tatmadaw. And we have also said in our earlier report, we mentioned 6 generals, my name, along with others, who we feel should be prosecuted and sanctioned.
Thank you. Thanks for the briefing and thanks for staying with this important issue. James Reinl with Al Jazeera. You mentioned the report that you released last month about the Tatmadaw, the conglomerates, and in that report you put down the names of the companies, the names of the conglomerates, the names of the foreign companies that are dealing with them and the countries they're from, France, Belgium, China, and so on and so forth. Since that report came out, have you seen any action taken by any of these companies? They said we're not going to do business with the Tatmadaw anymore, or any of those governments that those countries are, that those companies are in, saying maybe tightening the rules and preventing them from doing that business. Has there been enough impact from this report, do you think?
Well, it's only 1 month, so I think we have to give it a little time. But we have heard, I don't want to mention specifics, that 1 or 2 companies have actually begun to withdraw. But we will have to see. I give it 6 months, we will see what happens. I think there are some 1 or 2 companies that are considering leaving at the moment. What will happen down the road, I don't know. But I think there will be pressure, because I think the report becomes then a tool in the hands of civil society organizations, the press and others, to then ask an explanation from some of the companies. So these are things we can't have in a month. We have to work on them.
Thank you for your briefing. My name is Sato from NHK Japan. So has that report you just issued to being seen by the Myanmar government or submitted to Myanmar government? And is there any response from them?
We, it's a matter of practice that for 1 week before a report is released, it has to be sent to the government. So every report of ours goes to the Myanmar government a week ahead of time before it is reported, sometimes even much earlier. A first draft goes before, but then the final at least goes a week. If I'm not mistaken, if we can ask my OHCHR staff, it goes about a week before, isn't it? If I'm not mistaken, yes. And then we have not heard anything from them. The final one was given a day before.
Hello, Michael Schwartz from the New York Times. How much visibility do you have into Myanmar at the moment, particularly into Rakhine State? Are you able to, in some way, monitor these events on the ground? And then obviously I'll go through the report, but is there any indication that these sorts of practices, sexual violence in all the different facets that you described, do you have some visibility into whether these sorts of things are being carried out currently in Myanmar more generally, particularly in the different ethnic regions, but in Rakhine State in particular?
Well, I think at the moment, it is the Shan, and I think there's increased fighting in the Shan areas, if I'm not mistaken, in the Kachin areas, and there is an increase in this pattern of the 4 cuts theory, which includes the sexual violence. So there are cases of sexual violence coming out of those. In the ethnic Rakhine areas at the moment, the fighting is between the Arakan army and the Tatmadaw. and this is an interesting point of view. There are some cases of sexual violence, but not of the kind we witnessed against the Rohingyas. So, which raises then the whole genocide this discussion, because why so much against one group and not so much against the other? Maybe so we feel in the case of the Rohingyas it was really a kind of intent to destroy the population, to send them out, to make them flee. While in the case of the ethnic Rakhine, it's much more, it's there, but it's not so extreme.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much. One more question on this report. Obviously, at the time that the Rohingya were being, the clearance operations were taking place, Rohingya women and others were turning up in Bangladesh, and they were being interviewed by journalists, and they were saying, yes, I was raped, etc. So this has been known for a while. You've just done a more comprehensive report on it. But am I right in thinking that in your conclusions to this report, there are different levels at which you can say this sexual violence took place? And would I be right in thinking that you could, for example, classify it as a separate crime against humanity, and you've actually stopped short of perhaps the highest level that this use of sexual violence could be considered?
No, we haven't. We have gone to the highest level because basically what we are saying is that the nature of the sexual violence, along with other factors, that we say very clearly in last year's report, there should be investigation of genocide. I mean, so we have said the highest crime. And sexual violence is one of those things because of the nature and extent of it. Whether it was used in intent and with the genocidal intent to destroy in part or in whole or in part a population. And we have, in the other areas, Kachin and Shan, we have actually talked about crimes against humanity and attack on the civilian population. And sexual violence is one such attack on the civilian population. So we have, in the last year's report, gone that route where we set out the whole framework. What we're doing here is that same framework still remains, but we're just adding depth to it by a greater understanding of what was taking place. But we're accusing, the report stands accusing them of genocide investigations, because we need the genocidal intent is something that has to be investigated by, and we have now set up, as you know, there's a IIM monitoring mechanism, which is now a prosecutorial agency that is actually now, from our report, as we end September 30th, the council has set up IIM, which will actually receive the information from us and make files for prosecution. So that has already happened. The prosecutor has been chosen.
When you say council, that's
Human Rights Council.
Sorry, can I just follow that up? So you say the prosecutor's been chosen?
Yes.
But for what body?
The IIM, Independent Investigation.
And that's under the HRC?
HRC. It's under
Okay,
the
but
HRC.
you were talking earlier about a hybrid or an international.
But the prosecutor can only.
The prosecutor would feed that?
Yes. The prosecutor will create files. These files can go into universal jurisdiction cases. It can go into national cases. It can go into any international mechanism set up by the international community. So we're just going the next phase to prepare the material for a judicial mechanism.
And am I correct in recalling from the report, did you say that you've added names to that list
Of
being
six,
kept?
yes. This year there will be more added.
And will you say how many names?
we have not yet completely finalized it, but it will be with the High Commissioner's office. Names we are not disclosing to the public. They will be just handed over to the High Commissioner. We only disclose the 6 names, but we think bore the greatest responsibility.
And if you'd indulge me, just one more. We know the Security Council is not going to send this to the ICC. China will block it. I mean, that's been the pattern. So what's your go-around for this, basically? If you want an international mechanism, how will you get around this?
Well, I think we'll have to work on the Security Council. But there are other ways that you put pressure. I think the universal jurisdiction issue, if people travel to countries or anywhere near, they can be prosecuted. But I think we all understand the block. The other is the ICC has opened a window because Bangladesh has signed, and they've opened a window, so some of the issues may be taken in by that. But, there may come a time when maybe China can be persuaded to set up some kind of hybrid court. We don't know. We will have to work on that. It might be in their interest.
Thank you. My name is Mary T. from Kyoto News. Thank you for coming today and for speaking with us. I was curious about actually the situation of the people who are currently displaced, who have survived this, because we know that the biggest way to try to keep an individual down or peoples down is to harm them physically through these type of things. So how are you keeping these people who are currently displaced, who currently can't go home, educated on the situation that they're in and on what steps are being taken to help them so that they don't lose hope, so that they aren't given up, essentially? Because I think it's really important to keep them empowered at this moment. So can you tell me what steps are being taken?
I think when the FFM went this time in May to the camps, I could not go because there were Easter bombs in Sri Lanka, so it was a problem for me. But my colleagues went, and they were very impressed by how self-aware the refugees had become compared to when we went 2 or 3 weeks after what took place. But still, it's a terrible situation where there's no young men. I met young men who just desperate, really desperate. So unless we really find a solution, or we try to then go and provide them with livelihood training and skills, etc., it will be a problem. I think the international community will, if there's no response to this repatriation, the international community will have to take a call on whether one goes in with full support for them where they are.
Okay. If that's all, thank you, Ms. Coomaraswamy. Thank you all for coming, and this concludes the press conference.